sort of, I'm a white guy in his early 40s. I'm standing in the corner of a room with some blinds to my right and a sort of blank wall behind me. And I'm coming to you from Toronto, the historic lands of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. My ancestors were Welsh and German farmers who came to Turtle Island as uninvited guests. And I live near Garrison Creek. It's a small river that was rerouted underground about 100 years ago into the sewer system, but it still passes by my house. And when I take my daughter to the park, I can hear it gurgling under the sidewalk, its subterranean energy reminding us that ancient pathways continue to keep us alive. So we're all trying to rethink our connection to these local surroundings and to the histories that are embedded in the lands and the objects and the energies around us. But we also need to think about our connections to the global. So each of us here today has a connection to the crisis that's now unfolding in Afghanistan. Some of our panelists here are from the Afghan diaspora, and they maintain close ties to family, friends, and colleagues in the country. They have knowledge of the land, the languages, the cultures, and the history of that space. And all of those things have been targets of dispute over the last 40 years. And then for others like myself, the connection is more abstract and more political. And it's a connection that we need to trace it's a complex relationship that we need to trace through our relationship to the Canadian state and to the networks of international governance, including military alliances and relief organizations that it supports and funds. So as we think about our relationship to the land and the history of settler colonialism here, we should also reflect on our relationship to what Derek Gregory has called the colonial present, and to what Jérôme Classen describes as Canada's active involvement in the collective imperialism of the G8, of NATO, of the International Monetary Fund, and other Western power alliances. The global system that these alliances were set up to develop, to create stable sites for capital accumulation around the world, have, as we know, created massive structural inequalities, dividing the world into spaces where bodies are taken great care of, and other spaces where bodies are considered disposable. And the current situation of vaccine monopolies by Western countries, of spaces that are patrolled by drone aircraft where people can be disposed of without any recourse to legal trial or having any kind of rights like that. The ominous prospect of high-tech terror from the skies. This is part of what a situation of international deliberate lawlessness, where law is deliberately made to disappear by the powers that be, is part of what has happened to Afghanistan in the last 20 years since the NATO occupation began. In addition, I want to add that Afghanistan has been a laboratory of neoliberal occupation. It's very different than other wars that we've seen, even in that region, where occupation is offloaded to other actors. So not just nation states, not just the American empire, but allies, private mercenaries, NGOs, some of which are at an arm's length from that occupation, and some of which are deeply embedded and working with it. All of these interventions have created a situation that has ultimately failed, and that we are living in the aftermath of that failure. So I think it's an important time to think about what real self-determination and real sovereignty could mean, and what, for those of us in other countries outside of Afghanistan, what meaningful international solidarity might look like. And that may seem very far from the world of theater and performance, but it's not entirely. because as our panelists will elaborate, a war today is also a cultural war. And it is something that is engaged with intellectually the way that we think about other populations, other countries, and other politics, how we value certain bodies, certain lives over others. These are all cultural aspects that are created through ideas that are generated by intellectuals, by politicians, and sometimes by artists. So we'll talk about our relationship to the cultural politics that have created the situation that's unfolding in Afghanistan. That's the little introduction that I wanted to give, sort of give a sense of where we're coming from today. But I want to open it up to our panelists. And before I do so, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about who they are. So our first, and this is going to be a round table where what I'll do is I'll ask a few questions to begin with, and then we'll welcome questions from you. You can participate in the chat. You can just jot down some questions. I'll try to get to them, or you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to contribute verbally. So let's hear about our panelists. Shaista Latif is a queer Afghan working class artist, facilitator, and consultant. Her works and collaborations have been presented by Why Not Theatre, Koffler Center for the Arts, Mercer Union, Blackwood Gallery, the AGO, and festivals such as Summerworks, Progress, 7A, 11D. And in 2020, Latif toured her critically acclaimed show, The Archivist, until I believe COVID happened, right? And then it stopped. Did it interfere with that tour, or did you just squeak by?
I didn't get to the last city of Kingston. That's okay. It. So it ended March 13th abruptly, you know?
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you for that. And you may have heard her voice before if you saw the Oscar-nominated animated film, The Breadwinner, where she has a vocal credit. And you can catch her next month at the Art Gallery of Guelph, where she'll be presenting her upcoming exhibit, How I Learned to Serve Tea. And we also have with us Rahul Varma, who's a playwright, activist, and artistic director of Tisri Dunya Theatre, a company he founded, you won't believe how long ago, but in 1981. And Rahul is really a seminal figure in the development of diverse voices on the Canadian stage. So it's really an honor to be working with him. He also founded the important journal Alt.Theatre, Cultural Diversity in the Stage. He writes in both Hindi and English, which he learned as an adult. And his recent plays include Counteroffense, Bhopal, Truth and Treason, and State of Denial. We're also hoping that we'll be able to introduce you to Ariel Nasser, the fantastic documentary filmmaker, but he's not with us yet. So I'll introduce him when he arrives. Oh, that was very fortuitous. Welcome, Ariel. I will now introduce you. Ariel Nasser is an English language producer in the National Film Board's Quebec Atlantic Studio. Previous to joining the NFB, Ariel directed and co-produced the award-winning film, The Forbidden Reel, which is a fantastic documentary that draws on thousands of hours of film archives from Afghanistan to trace the second half of the 20th century through the lens of Afghan filmmakers. He's also the producer of the Academy Award nominated independent short drama, Buzkashi Boys, and he's also directed the Boxing Girls of Kabul, as well as Good Morning Kandahar, and an interactive documentary called Kabul Portraits, and the documentary La Mosquée, which documents the aftermath of the Quebec City mosque shooting. A citizen of Canada, Afghanistan, and the USA, Ariel lives and works in Montreal. So welcome all three of you. It's really fantastic to have such a rich panel tonight. I want to just give a moment to begin to just for each of you to introduce your work just a little bit, and for those who may not be familiar with it, and tell us about how it's been connected to the history of war in Afghanistan, or in the surrounding region. So maybe we can start with you, Shaista.
All right, I'll go up to bat first. First of all, thank you so much for making the space to have this dialogue. I think it's really important for us in our industry to be able to have these very complicated political conversations outside of, grants and, institutional politics. So for myself, I think I started off like anybody else, very naively as a member of the diaspora into the arts industry. And the last decade or so, I've just been going a little bit more deeply into, what nationalism is for myself as a member of the Afghan diaspora, what the national identity is, but really just participating in a politics of refusal. So for me, that kind of means following a Black radical tradition and thought, and also Indigenous thinking as well, in terms of creating your own kinds of systems and approaches. So I've had two projects called The Archivist and How I Learned to Serve Tea, and both of that work really assesses like the ways that we tell a narrative, who gets to be responsible for documenting a history of war. So a lot of my work is based on the research that I find that have to do with, the war on terrorism and surveillance culture. And a lot of my works are like performance lectures, right? So in essence, what I do is kind of take what I know of my parents' history and then try to challenge and confront myself to think beyond my parents' or my grandparents' memories and try to attach it to a more kind of global or internationalist understanding of how imperialism works. So I guess I'm going to try my best to kind of describe what I do, but it's kind of like, for example, if I go up there, you're not going to expect a story of childhood from me where I'm going to go into detail into my trauma. I'll play like a Slayer song and I'll roll on stage for a minute or two where there's like a slideshow of childhood photos behind me. So for me, my work is always kind of anticipating what the racial imaginary of a Canadian audience is, what my own racial imaginary is as well, and the kind of characters or archetypes that we've created in order to understand culture or identity. That's the best that I can do right now.
Oh, that's wonderful. That leaves us with some vivid images of you rolling around and thinking about complex ideas. Okay, let's go to Ariel next. If you could just give us a brief intro.
Sure, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I make documentary films. I really started making films more seriously, I would say, around the time when I first went to Afghanistan. So I was raised in Halifax, but with bizarrely in some ways, a very strong Afghan identity, a feeling that I was part of this nation. And so going to Afghanistan for me was a revelation because I was able to connect with that country as a nation in ways that I had never been able to connect with Canada, to feel this kind of sense of immediacy and interest in what was unfolding and kind of investment. And so I was immediately drawn to document the kind of history that was unfolding in front of everyone in Afghanistan at that time. So that was around 2006, 2005 when I first went there. And over the years, I think the way that my work evolved, mostly through being in Afghanistan and through this juxtaposition of being there, making work, viewing work about Afghanistan, and also kind of coming back to Canada, is that in some ways it obliterated my previous sense of what the world was and how it worked. To the point where I became, for some years, I guess, mentally ill and medicated. I think that over time, my work changed in the sense that I was initially observing Afghanistan through a Western lens. And of course, my lens is Western, but as time went by, I started to try and use my work as a framing device to kind of bring the voices of other Afghan artists to the screen in ways that they might not otherwise have been present there. And so hence the forbidden reel. I'll leave it there. Again, I just want to apologize for being late. I had a mix up with my child this evening. It's an honor to be on this panel. So thanks for your patience. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ariel. Children are completely unpredictable, and you may hear screaming from the next room in my house. Okay, I'll pass it over to Rahul. Tell us about your work and how it's connected to the history of warfare in the surrounding region, I think.
Thank you very much, and thank you, my fellow panelists. I formed Tisi Dunya in 1981, and very clearly with the idea that theater has to address social justice, and also it had to address the exclusion. And exclusion I'm talking about are people identified or distinguished by their color of skin or race, or those who had come from outside. The relationship between those people, whether that of the country of their origin or they're living in Canada, with the mainstream community, with the larger community, was established at two patterns. One was connecting with those countries through corporate globalization, and the other one was cultural exclusion. So, so I sort of formed the thesis with the idea of social justice and the representation, and yet idea was not representation of the diversity in a very for a display, but go into the content. Now that said, I think that with the relationship with the war plays, particularly in this context, T3 has a very long history of producing the plays that have been critical of war, but they also have been telling the aspects of the war that has not been generally told. And I'm using the word generally told in the Western theater. Aparna Sindhu's play, A Leaf in a Whirlwind, addresses the plight of a war child. Carmen Aguirre's play, The Refugee Hotel, talks about refugees, state of refugees in Canada from Chile after the massacre of Chilean people and killing of Salvador Allende, the elected Marxist president. I myself wrote, in addition, there had been a whole series of other plays, including The People Bar, focusing on Philippines. And Jim Forsyth collected a story of Afghan refugees in two different cities living in Montreal, in Canada, and he compared their stories. So those were the typical, very authentic stories told by the people, their own personal experiences. This also reflected the fact that there were not many Afghani playwrights who were creating the work that was going on the stage. It is around that time I created my own play. I mean, I have done some State of Denial on genocide in Rwanda and Armenia, but I did Truth and Treason. That was a direct response to the war in Afghanistan, which I questioned because I did not ever believe that war was to fight terror. I thought the war was the terror. And Canadian plays disappointed me. Many of the mainstream plays disappointed me. And I think this discussion will come out later because they reduce the geopolitical and conflict. They reduce the militarism of the bigger power to returning soldiers' trauma, as opposed to the destruction they had caused to the countries that were invaded. And the thousands of people were killed. You see, 80% people who died in any kind of a war are civilians. 80% people dying, civilians dying in war is equal to massacre. And yet disappointment I experienced here, with the exception to few plays, is that the Canadian playwrights were very concerned about the PTSD experienced by returning soldiers, as opposed to war resistors who were agitating and very concerned with the loss of the sex life of the returning soldiers, rather than entire city and community they had destroyed. So Truth and Treason play at the right after 9/11 questioned some of those things. And I think that what I try to do is to bring out the factors, the aspects of the war that have been otherwise explored. You see, I'm going to say one line more, and then I will stop for you for the next question. Majority of the plays written in Canada by conventional playwrights, I think that it's to be read by white playwrights, are about the simplicity of the war, that the governments have behaved irresponsibly, and people who are suffering as a result of it are the soldiers. But when immigrant writers like myself, who were prevented because of the poverty and because of not being given voice, we had to tell those stories. We revealed some facts. We revealed some facts that were not known. So Vajdi Mawad does that, Carmen Aguirre does that, Jim Forsyth did that, Shaista did that, I did that, but we are minority. So that was my motivation about this thing, and it is on that ground I'll be talking. Of course, I'll be talking a few other things also. So I'll stop here.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for just setting the tone of what you're going to be talking about. I'm struck by the fact that for 20 years the West and Canada in particular has been so involved in the politics of the country in Afghanistan. And yet, and this has generated so much news, so much, so many journal articles, so many books that have been produced on this subject. And yet, within that cacophony of material, so few voices from the region have actually been centered and actually heard. And I'm really struck that I feel like in Canada today, very few people have a clear idea of what daily life is like in Afghanistan beyond some stereotypes, and we very rarely hear those voices. But Shaista, I know that in your work, this is the question of who has the right to tell these stories is something that you wrestle with and you work on. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this question that I know you ask in The Archivist about who has the right, the responsibility to document the present. How do we go about doing this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I also want to say, like, Rahul, you're like bringing it so hard against like the theater industry. I love it. But I also just want to make mention of like the playwright Kawa Ada as well, who also wrote a play a few years ago called The Wanderers. So I don't want to be part of the erasure that is very common in our industry as well. So thinking about this, what happens when you are forcibly made into a minority and pushed into the margins because of the kind of topics that you want to tackle, right? So when we're dealing with like historical amnesia, which is a constant in our culture, when I'm doing The Archivist, I'm not thinking about, oh, I'm 1000% Afghan and this is the only identity and only nation that I identify with. So part of it is also just trying to reach out to the audience as well, and also asking them like, what is their point of understanding? What is the information that they know? So it's a lot of it is like interaction and like questioning and interrogating, like, in a quote unquote, like playful way with the audience to address this. So I guess let me see how I can clarify your question a bit more. Can you help me a little bit with where you want to go with this? It's really huge. Like I guess, yeah.
No, go ahead. If you have something that you want to thread you want to follow.
I think what I struggle with is that I have a very particular experience in which I was born and raised here. So if I was made back home, my mother arrived here at 8 months, of pregnancy, I always kind of think about, what would have happened in that month-long period if there wasn't a succession of of her arriving here, where, would I've been back home, but I also don't want to, exist in that state of like, what if I was one of the people back home? Because I also feel that kind of creates a certain kind of racial fantasy that I'm also not interested in investing in. But I think a lot of my work is just looking at how the diaspora relates to these kinds of story makings, and also what is their responsibility in talking about history and thinking beyond their parents' stories. But then also that I'm talking about the Canadian military, I'm talking about the Canadian state and its partnership with the US empire, right? And how it's continuing to build bases alongside the US empire globally as well, right? So when I'm thinking about the landscape of Canadian theater, even the tour that I did that was cut short because of COVID, after 6 years of like doing that show in festivals, and I choose to only do it in festivals because I don't necessarily trust the decision-making processes of artistic directors. So I enjoy short-term engagements because I get to work with community centers or other things that where I don't have to have this kind of imposed way of producing my work, which only makes me speak of tragedy as a form of like marketing, where I also want to talk about like endurance and also investing in your history, your language and culture, and that everyone has the right to be able to do it in their own way. But we have to figure out how to stay accountable to that. But even with this tour that was cut short, you know, with Why Not Theater producing it as well, like I've been continually told the work is really good. We love the work. It's really important. Your voice is needed, but you should go to the States or you should go to Europe, right? Like that's the suggestion and advice that I get even from people that produce my work and say that it's good, because what I really realize is that there's very little room for people that refuse to have a certain kind of like archetype of like suffering and trauma. Like all of those things are very real, but I also really want to focus on how people can empower themselves by just watching someone on stage also struggle with figuring how to tell a story without it being perfect. And it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to be messy, and it's okay to fuck up. And I think part of that work, I'm sorry, I'm going to wrap this up, has been like changing every year and growing every year, and doesn't have a static text, because I'm also trying to model what it means to learn as a diaspora artist and also confront my own very, you know, terrible biases that have been indoctrinated in me because I've been born and raised in this society.
Thanks for that. I think a couple threads that I would maybe want to pull out and ask the other artists about are this the sort of the difficult space of being a diasporic artist in an arts industry that has very particular ideas about the stories that those artists should be telling. And I wonder if this maybe connects to Ariel, you were talking about being confronted with these questions of identity as you travel to Afghanistan to engage with that history and that archive of film history that was preserved there. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that experience, but I also want to know what is happening with that archive. Oh, you're muted.
I am muted. Yes, no problem. So the archive, around the time when we were finishing the film in 2019, that archive was moved into the presidential palace, ironically, to make it safer. And now, of course, it's squarely in the hands of the Taliban. So but we really don't know what this new government is and what they're going to do and how they're going to behave. There's a lot of speculation. I'm actually worried because there's so much pressure on the government to behave badly. You know what I mean? It's like, if they don't, what will happen to our whole like sense of reality, right? And people are rightly, you know, I have a friend who works as a social worker for the military. So she's doing counseling with soldiers who were in Afghanistan, and people are, you know, you talk about moral injury, and now these people who went through all that suffering to and all that abuse, right? Who practically did all these abusive things, right, in the name of justice and women's rights and whatever. And now, you know, with the whole peace process, the kind of veil has been torn off of that hypocrisy of, wait, what was this about? So you can just make peace with them? I thought they were evil. I thought they were terrible. I thought we could never work with them, right? Wasn't that the reason we had to kill people who had affiliations with them? That we were literally killing people for their political opinions in the name of democracy? Like, if the Taliban aren't completely evil, how can we make peace with what we did in Afghanistan, right? Because we were literally killing people because they were affiliated with the group, right? So I think it's hugely revealing what has happened. So with regards to the archive itself, I think that the archive, we don't know what will happen. I know that there are many concerned people around the world who have connections to this cultural legacy that exists in that archive. There are many people among those people who have had firsthand experience with the excesses of living under this kind of theocratic, this kind of very harsh, extreme interpretation of Islam. And, you know, so hopefully there will be enough pressure and enough goodwill all around to kind of safeguard the archive. But we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen with it. One good thing is that over the years, you know, the archive was very porous. A lot of little bits were digitized and got out. They made it into other films. They made it onto other people's hard drives. They made it onto streaming platforms. And so we have these kind of piecemeal, this collection that has been digitized that will remain even if the originals are destroyed. I don't think that destroying the archive is part of anyone's plan. I don't think it's part of anyone's plan. This is a new government in a place that is extraordinarily difficult to govern, right? I think that their focus is elsewhere. I think they will, as far as we know now, the archive building is locked and nobody has entered. I don't think it's a particular concern, but and I think we have reason to believe that the new government would not take the initiative to destroy this culture, even if they disagree with a lot of what's in there, that they would see the value in preserving this, you know, national historical artifact. So I think probably the archive will be okay. I think probably the archive will last far into the future, and it will be there as this encapsulated memory of the past. So hopefully it'll be okay.
Great. Well, we certainly hope so. It is disconcerting. Maybe we can pull on some of those threads as well and think about what people have been saying about the stories we tell about war, right? And you know, there is. It seems to me like the mainstream narrative about the entire intervention in Afghanistan is built on a very sort of Hollywood type premise that needs protagonists and antagonists, and that a closer examination reveals that it's actually harder to pinpoint and identify who is on which side. And that was part of what was revealed in the Afghanistan papers that came out by the Washington Post last year, is that the US military was not able to really understand the terrain in Afghanistan in terms of the stories that they tell about war and how wars can be won, that kind of thing. So maybe to go back to Rahul, I wonder what you think is, you know, if the mainstream story about warfare is flawed and oversimplified, and that creates wars that don't function and that end in failure and needless death, what can theater artists be doing? Like, can we just undo those stories, or do we have to tell more complex stories, or do we have to tell more ambiguous stories? Like, I think about how in your work in Truth and Treason, you part of that whole play is about getting into the moral ambiguity of that play. And I'm struck by the way that you take us into the war zone. You give us characters who are from the region, and but you center it on the figure of an American captain who is faced with this sort of moral dilemma, pulled in both directions. And I wonder if you can tell me about you know, that writing choice of how you decide to portray this complex situation, what goes into creating the plot that you want to share, and those kinds of, and the characters that you decide to write.
Yeah, of course. Just I want to do a little bit of a pretext before I go into your question, and which is as to how did the play Truth and Treason came about. I mean, obviously, as soon as 9/11 happened, I knew that I was going to write about this subject. But a few things happened. One is that I saw a cartoon in one of the newspapers, major mainstream newspaper, and it had a US soldier pointing gun at the head of a Taliban extremist, and the caption read, "If you don't hand over Osama bin Laden to us, we will send your women to school." It brought some kind of a chuckle. Most of my friends laughed. And I said, what it actually means is that if, in fact, Osama bin Laden is handed over to the US won't care what happens to women of Afghanistan, which is exactly what has been proven the 20 years now. Mr. Obama went and supervised killing of bin Laden, but that did not finish Taliban. That did not have the handover of Taliban. In fact, Taliban ended up defeating US. So just preempting it here. The other incident was that I saw an image, very moving image of a terrorist who was captured by the US, and he was put behind the barbed wires in a jail, and he was permitted to receive his son. But they had put a brown paper bag on his head so he couldn't see his son. So he was just holding the hand of his son, but without being able to see. And I said, well, even a terrorist has a right to love his child. And at that time, I realized that this play that I have to write has to be questioning more than what a conventional play would do. And in regards to your question about why character Edward, the American soldier, goes through ambiguity, goes through the war and then resist, because telling the story from the point of view of a returning soldier will lead me only to what the conventional answer to the war is, that the war is a simplification of the politics and therefore it is the soldiers who are suffering. Captain Edward, in my play, even though he was leading the war, he was a war resister. And we have to be able to tell the stories, not of the returning soldiers, of the war resistors. Then we will get a more comprehensive and more complex image. I am perfectly happy we do a pro-war play as long as it can generate a good discussion. But the plays that were done were by default glorifying war, but they were making choices that were so simple that you basically were looking for external problem within your internal slogans like "Let's make America great" and things of that nature, at the cost of people who are you bombing kind. So that was a sort of a motivation behind writing this play, to reveal what is not known, and not only to create the empathy for those who have been misguided by their own governments. And that would have led us to the real conflict. And I think the other point was that it was very important that people of Iraq, people of Afghanistan, they tell their own stories. Majority of plays written here, they simulated the characters of the political other, in this case, Afghani or Iraqis. I actually had the Iraqis telling their own story, their own plight, and they are not necessarily, they were all flawed people, and they all had their agenda and the conflicting agenda, but authentically they were telling their own story. That's very important if we have to be talk about the diversity, inclusion, and as people's globalization.
Thanks for that. So I've had an opportunity to ask the panelists a few questions. I'd like to invite everyone in the audience. If you have questions, you're welcome to share them on the chat. I don't know if you can use the raise hand because I'm not sure I'll see it, but if you can share them on the chat, that would be great. I think maybe I'd like to ask a question about sort of beginnings and endings, because we've talked a little bit through what Rahul was sharing about how this situation began or what we know about it, and we know the sort of like long history of interventions by the Soviets and by the West that created the Mujahideen. And we know this, these are familiar stories. But the way that the recent history has been, or the recent events have been portrayed in the media, has been around the frame of an ending, right? That there's a kind of pathos to it, right? That we're sitting and we're watching, oh, how tragic the Afghanistan story is ending now. But of course, it's not ending. And in 10 years, we'll look back and we'll see how something else began right now. What are you looking for when you look at when you're listening to what's happening in Afghanistan? When you're trying to discern how safe the situation is, what place there might be for artists right now, what signs do you have at the moment? Or what do you think? Like Ariel was talking about how we can't really be sure what this government is going to do. Will they be as repressive, particularly against the arts, as the first Taliban regime was, right? A lot of people have written about how this is a neo-Taliban force that is a little bit more savvy. And I'll just share that someone shared with me a story from the Iranian news that was showing a live theater performance in which there was a Taliban censor at the side of the stage watching the performance and prepared to intervene. But even that is a shift from 1996, where there wouldn't have been a performance to begin with. So I don't know. Are you seeing signs of I mean, there are lots of worrying signs. Are there signs that, I mean, what are you looking for? I'm going to ask it in a more open way. What do you see happening right now?
Shaista, you want to go about?
I'm thinking about my own mother, who's like experienced like a second displacement in her life and having to leave Kabul and go to Dubai and then come back to Canada, like very recently in this. And for me, I'm thinking a lot about people who have having to be constantly in a state of displacement and awe and shock. And, for me, I don't think the Taliban have changed in any kind of way. I think that they are, just as severe, just as calculated, just as horrific as they were before, but now they've have a little bit of more savvy and they have a little bit more of, support of media presence and have been given legitimization, right, by these other kinds of foreign powers that have their own interests in it. But when I'm thinking about the arts, I personally wouldn't know because I can only make art from where I'm positioned in my own communities, in the land that I occupy right now. But I think often of like, the Caribbean writer, also of Claudia Jones, who talks about, the people's art is the genesis of their freedom. So I know this has been a discussion about, art, and that's really important, but it's just how people are able to express themselves is really crucial and important, but that's being like barred and banned on every single level. So there's this kind of very, grief-stricken responsibility in figuring out how do you speak for the people without speaking for them entirely, because they have their own sovereignty, their own opinion, their own relationship and experience living on that land and having that experience. But I don't see a change. I'm very worried. I'm very anxious. I'm very sad. I wonder how much longer we'll be in this state of, of being jeopardized constantly. Like it's an absolute shock to me. So that's the best way that I can answer that. I mean, I can't really speak for anyone back home myself, with the exception of in relation to my mother, but I don't think that it's going to magically change and they're going to become, more flexible and open and shifting and, create a democratic society. None of that is going to come into fruition, in my opinion.
Great, thanks for that. Ariel, did you have anything you wanted to add on that point?
Sure. I think what I can add is I've been in touch with many artists in Afghanistan. So because of the years of living there and working there, I have a large network of filmmakers, particularly in Kabul. And so I've heard from from most of them. And people are very worried. They're very, very concerned. People are calling me, speaking in low voices, feeling like they have to hide, like they have to conceal themselves. Others are less concerned. Others have already left. But the overall trend is people are extremely worried. Shaista, I think, is completely right in saying that the hoping for freedom of expression in the new government is probably unrealistic. Yeah, people are very, very worried. Fortunately, some have managed to get out of the country, but of those who have managed to get out, at least one had to leave her family back in Afghanistan and is terrified. And so this is a very difficult situation, extremely difficult for the artists in Kabul, the artists in Afghanistan. It's a kind of a situation where they were offered freedom of expression and they took it, right? And they did their work despite, all the money that was in Afghanistan. Very little of it went to genuine artists. So like there was a lot of media, a lot of TV was created, a lot of media was created, but for people who were doing art with integrity, there was actually very little financing, the type of thing that you would see in a country like Canada, where we have public funding for the arts, just didn't exist despite all of those 2 decades of development. What there was funding and financing from the embassies, and the lion's share of that went to things that were really aimed at pleasing the embassies themselves in order to capitalize on the moment. And so you saw stuff that was financed that really never made it to an audience. There was an industry that was kind of distorted because there were distribution fees as part of these grants, right? So an artist who makes their film themselves and tries to sell it to a distributor will be asked, and how much will you pay us to distribute it? And so despite this very, very tough environment for artists over the last 2 decades, there was a level of freedom of expression, and the artists took advantage of that. And with this quick reversal, this sudden reversal, they're really in a position now of having to wonder whether that will cost them their lives, whether it will cost them their freedom, etc. And so, yeah, you really can't overstate the state of distress that our artist friends in Afghanistan are in.
Well, I also, like, yes, absolutely. I'm also just like, I don't know what this rhetoric is as of late of trying to assure the public that the Taliban are capable of changing. I really don't know where that stemming from. I mean, I'm claiming ignorance in some kind of way. Of course, I recognize why, but it's to the comfort of like Westerners. It's to the comfort of people who live outside of the country to want to have this like baseless hope and this like belief that it won't be as severe as it was 20 years ago, that I think it'll be even worse, because they have even more at their disposal, right? They're able to manipulate the narrative even more because they've spent more time. And then I think how many of them who have been part of this, Taliban network have been trained and educated elsewhere in Europe, in the West, right? So they have this other kind of shorthand that perhaps the Taliban 1.0, as people reference it, didn't have. So I'm completely worried because it's like people my age. Do you know what I mean? They're in their 30s, if not younger, who don't have any kind of historical memory of that, severity. Also, like being Taliban apologists, right? Being like, well, maybe they'll, because they just don't know how to deal with the lack of hope and the sorrow. So they have this tendency to create this thing of like, well, maybe they have changed. Why don't we give them a chance? And that's wild to me. For me, it's the equivalent of being like, let's just bring the Nazis back in power. Like that just makes no sense to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would just I agree with you, Shaista. I would tease it apart a little bit. I mean, I think I started feeling that way when the peace process began. A complete incredulity, because if they were willing to do that, anything was possible. Any extent of hypocrisy was possible. So I think what's unfolded since then has felt a little bit more predictable and less shocking to me than the speed at which it happened was shocking, but the end result less so. And so for me, just to tease some of those things apart, for me, it's like the idea that the Taliban are somehow better than they used to be, or that they're not going to be completely self-serving, I would say is naive. However, I do see that the Taliban have power in the country right now, and they are, really in control. And so I think if you think about legitimacy, what legitimacy did the previous government have when it first came in? Well, it was the legitimacy that comes with conquest, right? And in that case, with strong foreign allies, right? And this is the same form of legitimacy that the Taliban have. So on a certain political level, you can't, you have to admit that they engaged in this process that was initiated by these foreign powers, and they came out on top. But my only, it's not for me, it's not an apology for them. My only, I guess, motivation for trying to say something about, it's useless to demonize this new government is because when we think about assisting a country, we should be thinking about not our political allies, but the people who are going to have to live under this government, right? And the last time people were starving, right, the economy collapsed. And this time there appears to be a strong effort to keep the economy going, of course, for self-serving reasons, but do we sanction the government? And if we sanction the government, is that out of any kind of, where does that come from? What's the motivation? Is the motivation that by sanctioning the government proactively, immediately, we can somehow improve the lives of people? Or is it about somehow saving face and saying, well, we're doing something, out of this failure, we're trying to at least show our opposition, in some sense, to what has happened, even though it was predictable, even though it was in some ways engineered, at least the exit was engineered. And this was always a possible outcome. I think that the media that we saw coming out of Afghanistan over the past 2 decades was some of the worst media that you probably have seen since, what's another war that we could talk about? The Vietnam War, I think, probably had comparable propaganda, right? So what you saw coming out of mainstream media outlets was false, was a series of falsehoods, and also a complete refusal to actually look at the reality from an objective perspective, even from someone sitting in their armchair in America or Canada, and say, are things really getting better, or have they continually declined? Has the violence continually got worse? I mean, it would go years of seeing signs of hope here and seeing signs of hope there, and then and then all of a sudden admitting, oh yeah, it's been a gradual decline since 2007. I mean, it was more than a decade of things getting worse, and $1 trillion. Now they're saying it was closer to $2 trillion in spending. And you drive downtown in Afghanistan near the ministries, you're on dirt roads with massive potholes. A tiny minority, maybe 20% of the city has sewage and plumbing. If you're going to do development, you might want to start with water and sanitation, right? So you've got these shopping malls on top of streets where the gutters are 4 feet deep with human feces that in the summertime, in the dry climate, goes up in the air like spores, and you can actually get salmonella just from breathing. Highest human fecal matter count in any city in the world, airborne fecal matter count. A terrible, terrible honor to have, distinction to have. So, it's of course people are confused. They've been listening to falsehoods for 20 years. And I mean, you would be sitting, and I don't think all of the media coming out of Afghanistan was bad. There are many good journalists, but they are the minority. They're the people who stay in one country, who learn what is happening, and who really put in the time and who really dedicate themselves to it. So much of the media coming out of Afghanistan, you'd be in Kabul and you would hear the CBC, for example, or you would read an article in a Canadian or American newspaper, and it would be just demonstrably false. It would be you could walk out your door and disprove it. And so in many ways, the media industry took advantage of this event, which you know, in a country that could kind of be a bit of a black box, right? If you got a quote from Abdul, who only has one name, nobody could check it, right? You know, so you had sources that weren't properly identified. You had stories that were completely apocryphal. You had people asking one person and then going with that, you know, even paying that person to talk to them and then going with whatever they said. I mean, it's just the worst track record of falsehoods you could ever imagine. And not too long ago, I was talking to a BBC journalist who wanted to feature the Forbidden Reel on an hour-long radio program they have. And I happened to mention to her that that this situation with the films and the burning of the films had been erroneously reported many times, including by the BBC. And that's where the conversation ended. There's this kind of brittleness. The journalistic, the media industry cannot listen to critique, cannot accept that a huge amount of what they do might be false because it would undermine their legitimacy. And so we're stuck. We kind of stuck in a situation where we have very little good information, and from afar, it's almost impossible to tell the difference.
Thanks for that. In the Canadian media, the war in Afghanistan was always portrayed as the good war, in contrast to the Iraq war, which we could be critical of. And partly that was because Canadian bodies were on the ground in Afghanistan, Canadian capital was deeply invested in it. But to what extent do you think was that ever able to distinguish itself, whatever good intentions that intervention may have had, from the legacy of Guantanamo Bay and extraordinary rendition and CIA black sites and drone bombs and military waste and a sort of NGO kleptocracy, those kinds of things that shaped the entire mission as one of decadence and corruption? That's my editorial.
Okay. Can I comment on that?
Yes, please.
I think that there are a lot of issues have come and they need to be posed as a question, and maybe answer could be found. But so I'm trying to say a few of those. See, because there's a mistake with the expectation that Taliban would do something which is probably will be gentler than how we have known Taliban. Of course, it is false. But at the same time, what is also true is the alternative, that there was an occupation for 20 years, which basically brutalized people, actually mellowed down some of the reaction against the Taliban. I mean, you know, Taliban could not have won this war against US had it not had the popular support. I don't believe that popular support was because anyone had love for Taliban, but people had hatred for occupation. And I think that one of the questions that why media was referred to Afghan war as a good war, because it linked the freedom of Afghani women to the defeat of Taliban. This was a very major narrative by the media. It's a false narrative. It was that clash of civilization mentality that it is white man's burden to emancipate the brown woman from the local oppressors or anywhere else. And for that, they weaponized the feminism. And what imperial feminism did, essentially, was took away the agencies of women of Afghanistan who many prior to all this were fighting a socialist struggle, in fact. Also, the issue was that Taliban and negotiation between Taliban and Mujahideen, because one was lesser than the other, has fallen apart. It really, the West has this tendency of making that we will make the alliance with the lesser of the enemy, also ignores the fact that they did not consider making any alliance with RAWA, the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association, which had declared Taliban enemy number 1, which had declared the warlords enemy number 2, and which had declared the occupation enemy number 3. They were all ignored. So in the end, people needed emancipation from Taliban. West, we as an international community have an obligation to stand for common people. We ended up making alliances with that one force over the other, and both are bad. Also, they talked about emancipation and freedom and the betterment of the women. Just look into some of the facts. I mean, what standards are we going to use to determine whether women have benefited in any way? The mortality of Afghani women is so much more. It has not changed in 20 years. Education has not gotten better in 20 years. More women have burned themselves under the US occupation. Social benefits have not improved in 20 years. So there is literally no guarantee that anything has changed or anything is going to change. So, one has to ask this question, that if the female mortality is high, dismal health conditions, the mortality of children is very high, poor education, why is it considered less injurious than militarization, starvation, occupation, and bombing of the people? And determining freedom sometimes, because under the occupation, some women had the freedom to wear Western dress, and that was presented as a standard in the media that, we have freed those women. So it was not a war to save Afghani women. It was an imperialist occupation, and it was banded at saving women. Women of Afghanistan were fighting for justice, and there would have been a socialist women's movement had there been no occupation. We know this. And this is a fact very well covered by the media. It has never talked about this, but there was a socialist movement in the making, was working, often underground, and this finished. The occupation killed it.
And those are some of those histories of Afghanistan and the different types of realities that have existed in that country that are not part of the mainstream narrative, but that are visible in Ariel's film, The Forbidden Reel, which documents modernist experimental films from the 70s made in Kabul, as well as popular culture experiments that show multiple different sides of Afghanistan. So I want to turn a little bit to sort of things that might be done as difficult as that may seem, but there are a number of campaigns that are going on, and I wonder what you think could be useful models. There are campaigns, for example, to bring the voices of Afghans to the stage in various ways. So there's a British Romanian theater collective called Benza that has been doing verbatim work with Afghan refugees in the UK, and they're staging a play based on that. And there's another one in LA by the LA Writers Center, also trying to amplify Afghan voices. And so working with people from those communities, those refugee communities, to tell stories in a public setting and create theater out of it. Another campaign is the campaign that the Documentary Organization of Canada has been working on to try to get documentary filmmakers to be recognized as journalist asylum seekers. So currently they're not, and there are a range of documentary filmmakers who remain in Afghanistan and unable to get Canadian visas or to get out of the country. So I wonder what you think. I mean, we sort of framed this discussion about thinking about what is real self-determination and sovereignty, and what is real international solidarity that's not just about performing a kind of benevolence or a kind of or that's not just a smokescreen for foreign, foreign intervention and that kind of thing? Are there things that as artists we can do that might intervene in the discussions on our side of things, or that might amplify voices from the region? What do you see happening that might be useful?
I think that just to add to it, there's a company called Bond Theater. It's a US-based company. I believe, I do not know where it is, but I mean, I communicate with them by email. They have done a lot of work in Afghanistan, particularly in Afghanistan with the children, particularly with the girl children. Now they are not being able to perform, and they have fled from Afghanistan where they were performing, and they are trying to creating a corridor for the artists to come to the West as a refugee. And that raises a very important question, because Canada has taken a huge number of refugees from Afghanistan. So has US, so has Germany, and rightly so, because these are the people who helped the Canadian Army there. But in the process, something has been left out also, because these people, even though very deserving and have been given a refugee status, they are also a kind of a collaborator.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I didn't clock that in. I think I'm really just thinking about, like, I mean, all of this is necessary. Every form of storytelling, any kind of counter narrative that we create, whether it's online or off, any form of documentation, any form of archiving is really, really important, because we do live in a society, in a capitalist system in which, the state is dependent on this historical amnesia, right? So I'm all for this, but at the same time, we have to think about the ethics of engagement. How do we engage with these marginalized communities? How do we make them the subjects of our work? How do we consume their stories? How do we tell their stories? Like, how are we doing in a way that actually empowers them? And then we're not, again, being in the state of being like extractors, right? And exploiters in telling their story. So that's always been a very big challenge for me. So, a question that I often get when I do get some media support, if a show is going up, is like, is your work helping women in Afghanistan, is the question that I get, right? Will this work help support women in Afghanistan? And I think that's one of the most absurd questions that you could present to me, right? Because I go, there's just this idea that these women cannot help themselves, do not have their own autonomy, do not have their own agency, do not have their own movements that they have been part of for many years, that they don't need me. They're perfectly capable of creating their own sovereign states. The country itself, the people itself are perfectly capable of creating their own power structures and systems in place that will benefit them, that will create what they need for themselves. No matter what I say, I can't really speak, fully about what is best for my homeland, because I'm not a citizen of my homeland. I'm not living there. I'm not occupying a day-to-day there. So then I go, as a Westerner, then what is my responsibility in making sure that these counter narratives exist, that I'm supporting that? And I think a lot of the work is like, researching and asking about the ethics of engagement, and also just like recognizing, like, if I'm an artist and I'm really dedicated to telling the story, like, what is actually my intention and what is driving me? Is it one that is, self-serving, where I want to be known as a particular kind of artist who does this kind of work without actually engaging with my community or knowing how to speak my language or knowing anything about my culture? Or do I, when do I take a step back to make sure that voices are highlighted? But again, like, when I think as a I'm considered a political radical artist was a joke, because I don't think I'm really that radical or political in my work. But I go, if I'm being prevented in talking about these counter narratives or these sovereignty or this agency, then like I wonder what kind of hope any kind of migrant or immigrant or refugee has in being able to tell their story here, right? Like, there's just I think we are very, 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 very far away from actually cultivating the space for people to have these kinds of styles of engagement. We don't even, you know, on a very basic level, even the techniques that people learn in theater school or in these creative art schools, they're, you know, kind of UK like Alexander technique, other shit like that. People don't even study Ferrer here, right? There is no, there's a lack of like global understanding or global studies. So I'm, you know, when I'm really excited for diaspora to kind of, you know, take up space and being able to assert their right to be able to tell their own stories. But at the same time, I feel like we have to take so many steps back now to really, you know, understand like what is our drive to tell this story? Is it really to impose some kind of change? Is it to entertain the privileged and the elite? Is it to comfort ourselves? Like, these are the questions that I want to be able to assess in my own practice and my own engagement with communities, right? Instead of diving in fully and being like, I'm going to be the one that's going to carry the torch and speak for my people. I don't even think I have the right to speak for my people at this point after many years.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think it connects to what Ariel was pointing out about journalism in the region, right? The Western journalism, they just you know, and verbatim theater can be like that, right? Like, oh, here's some people. They're authentic people from this region. Let's hear what they have to say, and that can be a form of, as you say, extraction or you know, performative allianceship or just trendiness, right? Ariel, I wanted to hear your perspective on some of the campaigns that are going on, or maybe you're involved in some, I'm not sure.
Well, you know, I have to be honest with you, like for me, it doesn't feel so political at this point, because I have, as many of us do here, I have friends and family in Afghanistan. So for me, the urgent thing to fulfill is to listen and to try and help. Right, so that's sort of the level where kind of my efforts are right now. I think you know, for me as a filmmaker, and as a cinema lover and somebody who thinks that Afghan cinema is full of powerful messages and really has a legacy, especially for those of us who, let's face it, there's almost 2 Afghanistan. Maybe there's 1,000, but there's among those who live outside Afghanistan, it's almost a nation. I mean, because so many of us, considering the size of Afghanistan, it's a massive diaspora, and there's a lot of shared experience, a lot of trauma, inherited trauma, and that I think it has inhibited, and poverty, that has inhibited people from really being heard in the diaspora, as well as systemic racism and many other obstacles that people face that are part of that, such as, you know, being a doctor and absolutely not being able to practice in Canada, for example. You know, just one of many obstacles. People basically have to start over in the worst states of having experienced the worst kind of trauma. And so it's almost an impossible task for that first generation a lot of the time. Not in every case. There are people who are more privileged. My father came over in '74. He came before the war, and he was able to bring many of our relatives over during the war in the '80s and the war in the '90s. And so they're all there. Everybody is on this kind of spectrum of how capable they are in that moment of being able to advance whatever their career, whatever. Many people are more focused on survival. So for me as a diasporan Afghan, I think, you know, and on a personal level, knowing all these filmmakers there, I have this drive to really want to assist cinema artists and any of the artists that I know in Afghanistan to leave Afghanistan. And it's there's always this you know, you hear people say, well, you know, you can't take all the intellectuals out of Afghanistan. You can't drain Afghanistan of all its culture and all, you know, and that is a tragic thing that's happened to the country. But at the same time, we don't want to lose the incredible talent that is there. And I think even if you bring people outside of Afghanistan, if people choose to leave because they have their reasons, they have urgent reasons, then they can still have a voice. And I worry that for those who stay, they will lose their voice. And so, in a sense, you know, I think there's a lot of positive outcomes from our artists and filmmakers being able to leave the country and having that mobility, and hopefully being given some opportunities to do that. But of course, that makes it sound easy. You know, people are being killed at the airport. people are being imprisoned. It's not an easy. People are being turned back at the border. So it's not by any means an easy thing. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think these initiatives that you've mentioned, many of them I think are really, really important. I think it's important to support those who want to leave Afghanistan because for reasons, you know, to do with their freedom of expression. I think it's important to support them, and so that's basically my feeling.
We do have time for one more question if anyone in the audience has a question for the panelists. Otherwise, Shaista, were you about to jump in there? No? Okay, I misinterpreted that. I mean, I wonder if we're thinking about action, if we have to go back to that question of relationality and what our relation is to that space. It is via the Canadian state, and maybe we need to be making demands that the Canadian state accept wider numbers of refugees. You know, at this point, you know, it might be as simple as that, or it might be about particular things that can be offered to people who are stuck or who are trying to flee.
Can I just add one thing? I think in the past there's been a tendency after an engagement in Afghanistan to forget about the place for a little while, right? Take a break from it. Let's not think about Afghanistan. Let's you know, nobody wants to read about that for a little while, right? Our people aren't dying there anymore, so let's move on. I think that's dangerous, and I think that in a general sense, that is something, you know, to be avoided. And I see and I hear from so many Canadians who have no specific connection to Afghanistan, but who have tried to educate themselves over the past couple of decades that we've been engaged there, that there is an incredible amount of empathy. And I think, like you say, Matt, I think it's important for us to at least continue to think about Afghanistan and find our own ways to engage with it and to try to.
Yes, I think also like, you know, I'm just thinking in light of, you know, just watching, you know, all the Haitian migrants also being denied access at the border, and some of them being placed, again, the possibility of being placed at Guantanamo. Do you know what I mean? Of rehousing them there. That's utterly insane. And the fact that this place is still functioning and in operation so many years later, like this thing of like this constant erasure and let's take a break from it is like, this is all connected to so many other global movements of displacement that are happening all around the world. And, you know, and I think there's only about like 80,000, you know, Afghans in the entirety of Canada. Like, yes, Canada can afford to bring in more displaced people, but then I also kind of think like, will their education be recognized? Will their credentials be recognized? I think of all the generations that have been lost, including my parents' generation, and not being able to adapt or progress or advance and never be able to go beyond, you know, this, you know, living below poverty because their credentials, their education were actively denied. So you have like a whole host of people being globally displaced and then coming here and then being forced to be like subservient citizens, right? And taking also like low paid wage jobs with like no benefit, right? Like this is also not the future that I want for my people. I don't necessarily want my people to be displaced, to come to a Western country, to be subjected, to be paid low wages, and to encounter poverty for the rest of their lives and encounter trauma. I would very much like my people to remain in their homeland and have rights and access in the ways that they would without this legal occupation, right? So I struggle with being like, yeah, I want to advocate for the safety of anyone that is seeking asylum, but at the same time, I also want to advocate for foreign powers to get the fuck out of the country and leave the government to decide and the people to decide what is best for them and for their nation. So it's, you know, I do sign those petitions. I do support those initiatives. I do work a lot with migrants and refugees, especially with settlement agencies. But at the end of the day, like, this is not the ideal for them to come here. Like, my parents always imagined going back home after a few years. And that's what they told me growing up is like, we're going to go back. But that never happened.
But also,
go ahead.
Just a very small point, in complete agreement with what Shaista is saying, what Ariel said. But also, there are two groups of refugees that we're talking about at this point. And they're both legit, absolutely. Those who help the Canadian forces, the translators, the interpreters, the drivers, the chefs and all that, they collaborated with the foreign force, and they qualified to be the refugee. Canada looked after them, but also there are civilian refugees who are under severe threat, and we should not lose sight of them, because we are going to be able to import a very large number of those who somehow in some capacity collaborated with the occupying forces. Women, for a variety of reasons, qualify to be refugee in more circumstances than not.
Thanks for that. We have a question from Mandeep, but we may have already touched on it. Mandeep is asking, what are the ethics of engagement with one's homeland for a diaspora person? So if you have anything that you'd like to add to that question, then please go ahead. But I think we've addressed it to some extent.
Yeah, we addressed.
Okay. All right. I think we are running a little bit short on time. So I want to thank everybody for participating. Thanks for joining us this evening. Thanks to our panelists, Rahul Varma, Shaista Latif, Ariel Nasser, and for Samar Mahmood for organizing this, Tisri Danya for hosting the event, and all of you for just coming and sharing in the experience. Thank you very much, and I'll wish you good night. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone.